information, and I'd love to share that with our listeners. So thank you for joining us today, David.
Well, thank you again for having me.
And thanks for all this great information. Now, I know that you are an environmental laboratory with accreditation. What does accreditation mean?
Well, there are different types of accreditation. We're accredited by California ELAP program, Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, within the state of California, which is required to test for pesticide residues in food products. But we're also accredited under ISO by ANAB, which is part of the American Society for Quality. And that's ISO 17025, where we had to develop standard operating procedures for essentially everything we do in our operations, and also method folders for all the analyses that we perform that we want to be accredited for, and also position descriptions for each of our employees and a variety of other information.
Right. I will just say that's complicated, but really necessary, because this is the kind of lab people want to use to get their things tested because of all the work that you have put into it. Now, you threw out a little teaser before we went to our break, and that's something that I guess is a newer testing that you're getting into as of 2015, not so long ago, and that is cannabis testing.
Well, yes, we actually considered getting into it 4 or 5 years ago, but because of the federal regulatory and legal issues, we decided it was too great a risk. But we, again, started further work on our method development at the beginning of 2015, and we initiated commercial testing at the beginning of 2016, and now it's become a very significant part of our business.
Well, let's put it this way. It's kind of ripping across America as sort of the latest legal thing that people can do, you know, for both recreation and medicine. So I think it's going to explode tremendously. In fact, John Boehner, who used to be in the Senate, is now a big lobby, has joined the lobbying efforts of promoting marijuana both for medicinal and recreational use across the whole country.
Well, the state of Oklahoma just approved it for medicinal use within the last week, I believe.
This is what I mean. It's just galloping along there. Now, what does that mean? Because truthfully, I'm asking you because I don't know. So what kind of testing would be involved with your laboratory in its relationship to cannabis?
Well, in the cannabis, we test for potency, including the THC and the other active compounds, and also terpenes, residual solvents, which would be contaminants, also pesticide residues, also microbial contamination, and filth, insect fragments, rodent hairs, things that generally should not be in the product.
So that's really interesting, because I know that there's stores opening up, and not here in New York yet. We don't have that, but I've seen it in Colorado. When I visit my son who lives in Seattle, Washington State, there's actually stores you can walk in and openly purchase various kinds of marijuana products, both to smoke and edibles, as you said. So I have heard that it's actually prolific for them to be different qualities in terms of THC content, but also sometimes very highly sprayed with things that might be considered toxic.
Well, we certainly do find pesticide residues in cannabis and in cannabis extracts and hash and edible products. But over time, some of the people we do work with in the edibles area, they do extensive testing, and certainly over time, the levels and the incidence of pesticide residues drop fairly dramatically. And a number of our customers make claims that there's no pesticide residues in their edible product. I don't like such claims per se, because if you go down to a parts per trillion or a parts per quadrillion level, if you go to a low enough level, you'll detect things in anything. But effectively, some of these people have excellent quality assurance, and they're able to reduce the levels of pesticide residues to non-detect levels.
So I understand what you're saying, but truthfully, there's something called, you'll know the term better than I, something like no detectable level, and then who decides what detectable is? I mean, I see that all the time in water reports from towns.
Well, that's right. The level of detection is a critical element in understanding and interpreting an analytical report. If you have a very low detection limit, well, that sometimes is more difficult to achieve, but it may also be better evidence that the product is safe. And when we're doing work for submission to U.S. Food and Drug Administration, they will specify what detection limits we must achieve, and quite often these are extremely low.
So that's an interesting fact, though, that we're sharing with our listeners. That thing called no detectable levels is not a fixed point. It can vary. And one testing agency might, like you said, the FDA perhaps, or the EPA will mandate a no detectable level, but I don't know. That might be decided differently in different situations, such as in water testing.
Well, Food and Drug oftentimes will also mandate that specific methods be used. So if you're interpreting an analytical report, it's important that you look at the method that's referenced on the report, and that gives you a better indication as to the sensitivity and the level of detection that can be achieved.
Well, thank you so much for that information, and I want to remind our listeners that you are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, and today our guest is Mr. David Eisenberg, the president of Anresco Laboratories, and we're so happy to have you on board with us today. So, who is doing the testing for the cannabis products? Are those people who are, putting it out on the marketplace, or the government or the state? Who is actually interested in testing?
Well, we're doing analytical work for growers and for distributors and for edible food product manufacturers. And the state of California has now mandated compliance testing. It was it was mandated to take effect the beginning of the year, but it's a practical matter. The enforcement has started just July 1st. So right now our laboratory is totally booked up with work right now.
Okay, well, that's good news for you. It's really interesting how you had set yourself up in something that seemed a little bit more obscure, and now it's becoming, really, really popular. Another one that I'm sure you know a lot about and you hear a lot about is glyphosate.
Oh, yes, that's been an issue of concern. I think it was considered for inclusion in the Prop 65 California listing of carcinogens. I'm not sure it was included in that list or not. Of course, it's a glyphosate is marketed under the name Roundup by Monsanto, and it's probably the most widely used herbicide in the world. So this makes it a natural, target for anyone looking for anything that might be wrong, because it's got such a wide use. And there's been a growing concern about low levels in food products. And that has led to additional business for our laboratory, testing a great variety of food products. The analyses, we've run it for 35 years here, but in trying to achieve low detection limits in different food products, it requires method modifications, and we've tested maybe 50 or 100 different types of products, each of which requires slightly different methodology to achieve good analytical results. And the impetus, I think, is coming from people that are really concerned that trace levels of glyphosate in their foods may represent a health hazard. I'm not expert in being able to understand the significance of what very low levels might be, but we've certainly been running far more analyses here in the last year or two than we ever ran before.
Well, actually, there's certainly an interest in that testing, and glyphosate was mentioned by the World Health Organization as being a possible carcinogen. And you did bring up Monsanto because they use that particular well, it's not really a pesticide, it's more an herbicide, in their case against weeds, prolifically, as you mentioned. And one of the problems with it is that, by the way, Monsanto, the name is being dropped because the Bayer Corporation purchased that company, and they're going to change the name, so Monsanto won't be there, and I think they're going to rename glyphosate, just to throw a little confusion in the mix. So it's very interesting, both the politics of it, and of course on your end, you're more interested and focused on the science behind it. And I so much admire the work that you've been doing.
Well, I'm afraid our primary focus is in analyzing food and other samples and trying to generate the best data we can. So I'm afraid my scope, my vision is fairly narrow, I'm afraid.
No, it's been really, really excellent, and I want to thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I know you also have an environmental laboratory accreditation for chlorinated pesticides, as you said, organophosphate pesticides, the long list of, unfortunately, environmental toxins that we might find.
Yes, well, we started doing mostly residue testing for organophosphates, organochlorides, and carbamates in particular, in about 1986, largely for Nutriclean program run by Scientific Certification Services, where they had contracts with supermarket chains to test fruits and vegetables as they were being delivered, and for pesticide residues, and then would certify that the products had no detectable residues, usually at a level of 0.05 ppm at the time, and that's where we really gained a lot of our experience and developed our methods and our technology.
Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing this with us today on our show, Herbally Yours, and thank you so much, David Eisenberg, for being our guest. And
thanks so much. Have a great remainder of the week.
And you. And thank you, listeners, for tuning into Herbally Yours, produced at the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, email whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.